everyone's banding about the U.S. KPS and Science Act like it's the answer to everything.
Yeah, it's huge.
But getting your head around it all feels a bit like, trying to build a ship in a bottle in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're turning on the floodlights and, well, let's just say we're going to build that ship.
And it's not just about building the ship, right? It's about understanding the waves it's making, the whole global tech ocean it's sailing in.
Exactly. Because this isn't just some domestic policy. This is the U.S. drawing a line in the sand, especially when it comes to, competing with China in the tech arena.
Big time.
So before we get lost in the weeds here, can you give us the explain it to me like I'm five version? What is this act really all about?
Okay, so picture this. Imagine a world where your next phone, or even that life-saving medical device you might need, imagine if whether you could even get it depended on where it was made, who controlled the tech behind it.
Okay, getting a little scary there.
That's the future the THOPS Act is trying to, let's say, shape.
Yeah.
It's all about pumping billions, and we're talking $280 billion here into boosting U.S. semiconductor manufacturing.
Right, because remember that whole global chip shortage thing not too long ago?
Exactly. This act is trying to make sure that never happens again, at least not to the U.S.
Yeah, those were some dark times. Definitely a wake-up call.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's about making those chips on home ground. But it's not just about handing out blank checks, right? There's that whole other side to the act with the guardrail provisions.
Yes.
Sounds kind of ominous when you put it like that. What's the deal with those?
That's where things get interesting. Think of these guardrails as strategic levers. The act basically lets the U.S. say to companies taking these funds, you can expand your advanced chip making here, but not there.
Oh, so it's targeted.
Very much so. If a company takes U.S. money, it's going to face some serious restrictions on, say, upping its production in China.
Wow. That's a pretty clear message. So it's not just about boosting U.S. production. It's about strategically limiting China's access to.
You got it.
That sounds like a pretty big departure, from how the U.S. has always approached trade, especially with China.
You could say that. For decades, the mantra was all about free trade. But the THOPS Act. This signals a pretty big shift, a shift towards what some folks are calling techno-nationalism.
Which is?
Using government power to, shall we say, mold the technological landscape and, by extension, the future of global power.
So we're moving away from a free-for-all in the tech world towards a more strategic, some might even say protectionist approach.
It seems that way.
This has got to have some pretty huge implications for companies, right? The ones caught in the middle of all this.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Multinational companies, they're now forced to make these really tough choices about where they put their money.
Right.
Because if they side with one superpower, they risk alienating another. The stakes, they're through the roof.
It's a geopolitical high-wire act. And companies. They have to be way more strategic to navigate this. But is the THOPS Act really that radical? Or is it more like a sign of things to come? I mean, hasn't China been playing this game for a while now?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some folks argue that the U.S. is just, returning the favor. China's been intervening in its own tech sector for ages.
So is the U.S. playing catch-up? Or is this something, well, more transformative?
Yeah.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what this means for companies, are there any historical parallels we could look at, to understand this whole techno-nationalism thing?
That's a really good point. To really wrap our heads around this, we kind of need to zoom out, look at the bigger picture. History is full of examples of nations using tech for, well, let's just say, a competitive edge.
So you're saying this whole thing with governments throwing their weight around in the tech world, it's not exactly a new trick.
Not even close.
What's the historical precedent here?
Well, take the space race, for example. It wasn't just about, planting a flag on the moon.
Yeah.
It was about who had the technological edge. That whole rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, that fueled crazy investments in science and engineering. And we got some groundbreaking tech out of it, stuff that changed the world. And we're seeing echoes of that today, but instead of rockets, it's semiconductors that are at the heart of it all.
So the THOPS Act is kind of like the U.S., planting its flag in silicon or something like that.
Something like that.
But the space race was like a two-player game.
These days.
These days. The tech world is way more complicated. How does techno-nationalism even work with so many players?
That's what makes it so interesting. It's not just a U.S.-China showdown anymore. Look around. You've got the European Union, Japan. They're all enacting their own industrial policies, right?
Yeah.
They want to be top dog in their own tech sectors.
So it's like everyone's trying to outmaneuver each other.
It's a global chess match, constantly trying to predict the next move and make sure you've got a good position.
Okay, so it's a multipolar world, tensions are high, everyone wants the biggest piece of the pie. What does all this mean for companies? It sounds like a recipe for disaster, trying to operate globally with all these moving parts.
Headaches, for sure, but also opportunities.
How so?
Smart companies are realizing they can't just be bystanders in this game. They've got to get in the arena.
What, like start lobbying or something?
Engaging with governments, definitely. Understanding the policies, for sure. Maybe even trying to shape those policies a bit. They've got to be proactive.
So it's not enough to be a tech giant anymore. You got to be a geopolitical strategist, too. That's intense. What would that even look like?
Well, look at TSMC, for example.
TSMC.
Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company. They're a major player in semiconductors. And they've had to make some really tough calls, balancing pressure from the U.S. to build factories here, but also, keeping their relationship with China from going south.
Yeah, they're walking a tightrope for sure.
It's a classic example of how geopolitics is changing the game for businesses.
Absolutely. Are there any companies that are actually using this new landscape to their advantage?
There are a few. One that comes to mind is Samsung.
Okay, yeah, the South Korean tech giant.
They've been pretty smart about it and investing in diversifying their production. They're building chip plants in the U.S., taking advantage of those TPS Act incentives.
Right.
But they're also maintaining their presence in China.
Hedging their bets.
Exactly. They're not putting all their eggs in one basket, or rather one country. It's a way to reduce their reliance on any one market, any one political system.
So diversification is key. Kind of like the old don't put all your eggs in one basket adage, but, global scale with billions of dollars at stake. What other strategies are we seeing?
Friendshoring is becoming a thing.
Friendshoring? What's that?
It's about partnering up with countries that, you share values with, countries with similar geopolitical interests.
Oh, I see.
It's a way to build more resilient supply chains.
Because you're working with countries you trust.
Exactly. Less likely to suddenly pull the rug out from under you.
Makes sense. This all sounds incredibly complicated, though. How are businesses supposed to wrap their heads around all of this? Especially smaller companies. How can they keep up with all these changes?
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because it's not just about knowing the rules of the game. It's about figuring out how those rules might change next week, next year. It's about being flexible.
So adaptability is the name of the game.
Exactly. You need to be able to weather the storm no matter what gets thrown your way.
But how do you build that kind of resilience into a company? It's more than just having a crisis management plan.
Right. It's much more than that. It's about creating a culture of agility.
So it's not enough to be strategically aligned. You have to actually operate differently in this new techno-nationalism landscape.
It really is a whole new ballgame. It's a cultural shift as much as a strategic one. Think of it this way. Companies used to want to be well-oiled machines, right?
Right. Efficiency is key.
Exactly. Predictability. But in this new world, you got to be more like an organism.
An organism.
Flexible, responsive, able to adapt, to evolve as the environment changes.
So less machine, more chameleon.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that. But how does that translate into, actual things businesses can do?
It starts at the top. You need leaders who embrace change, right? Who are comfortable with a little risk, some experimentation. Leaders who empower their people to make decisions.
So less top-down, more decentralized.
Exactly.
That makes sense, but it can't just be about rearranging the org chart, can it? You've got to give employees the right tools, the right mindset.
Absolutely. Continuous learning is huge now. Employees at every level need the knowledge and the skills to navigate this landscape.
Which means?
Geopolitical awareness, data analysis, cross-cultural communication. These are the must-haves in a techno-nationalist world.
Wow. It's like business skills are meeting international relations. That's a lot to keep up with.
It is, but it's also an incredible opportunity. Because the companies that can figure this out, the ones that can be globally competitive and geopolitically savvy, they're going to be the ones writing the rules for the future.
It really feels like we're entering a whole new world. Business, tech, geopolitics, it's all blending together. So as we wrap up, is there one big takeaway you'd leave our listeners with today?
I think the biggest thing is knowledge is power. In this new era of techno-nationalism, you can't afford to be in the dark. Staying informed about the geopolitical forces at play, it's not optional anymore, it's essential.
Forewarned is forearmed, as they say.
Well, this has been an incredible look at the CHIPS Act and what it means for the future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time when we'll dive into something else that's shaping our world.